Hey, what's up guys? This is Brian at Whisper Status 74. Welcome to the community. Welcome to the channel. This is the first time you are seeing me. Please consider liking and subscribing. We are real tech for real people. Today's video is going to be about 8K and the phasing out of 4K. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. I did a video today on a price drop in regards to the Master Series Z8H and the Samsung 900TS. And the reason I'm doing this video now is in the comments, there was some confusion that I was supporting 8K or by me saying 4K was being phased out, I was being not fair to 4K. And I want to talk about that in this video. Is 8K here? Is 8K necessary? Is 8K phasing out 4K? Is 8K something you have to have? The answers are yes and absolutely not. All right, guys, this is a tech therapy video. These are long discussion-based videos. I will try to keep this one as short as possible. So I did a video this morning, and I was in Best Buy, and did a Best Buy video before that, which was a little somber about all the jobs that are being lost. The video yesterday, or I should say today, was actually about a $500 price drop on the 8K flagships from Samsung and Sony. Now that 950TS is the flagship, but those are the leading displays that were very expensive last year. We are now in 2021, and we're gonna have our new panels coming out, and 8K is maybe not 100% there, but you're seeing it being pushed by TCL. You're seeing, obviously, LG, Sony again. Samsung is always at the front of that. And I had mentioned in the last video that it's being phased out. 4K is being phased out. And I had a lot of backlash. So while I just were responding to those comments, I figured, let's just do the video now. Because, you know, I have my notes. I don't write a script, clearly. I'm all over the map, but this is the way that I film, and this is how the channel is designed. I spend a ton of time in the comments, perhaps to my detriment at times. I get pulled into these conversations. Now, the conversations weren't toxic at all. If they were, I would just ignore them. These were more of confusion of how can I say 4K is being phased out. And I think what I'm trying to clarify is we don't have a say in the matter. It's not us as a community or as most users. I only know of a few people that actually use 8K. One of my friends, Jennifer Gala, who actually has a channel, who is a photographer and a filmmaker, has been using 8K for the longest time, but she has the equipment to take advantage of it, whether it's the GPU, the cameras. She can shoot in 8K. Her channel is based in 8K. She films 16K. Other than that, maybe a couple other people that actually game here and there with settings on low with a 3090, which is like a $2,000 GPU, are able to actually use 8K. So what I'm trying to say is it's not necessary. 8K isn't something I think we need. And arguably, 4K wasn't something that we needed either. I will tell you that with every change in technology, now I'll say this, we all love technology, but like any love, and this is for those of you in the comments and a lot of other channels as well, with any love, the most unbecoming thing of love is jealousy and insecurity. Have a discussion without feeling the need to defend your product. You can have an open mind about what you're looking for, and we can all have our fanfare or bias. But what I was hearing was, you're out of your mind, 4K is new, 4K is just getting going. And the part is, yeah, in some ways it is, because now 4K is something that the common person knows. The person, your grandparents know what 4K is now. But I would argue that by the time your grandparents figure out that this technology is here, it's typically on its way out. It's like the most famous athlete in the world. In boxing, people knew who Pacquiao and Mayweather were at the end of their careers. It's amazing. 4K is my favorite format. 1080p, plasma, but when we got up to the larger sizes, I never thought I'd have a 75-inch TV. And that's not what's behind me. This is my 55-inch while I'm waiting for my 77 to come back. We're going to get back to that. But being somebody who always wanted larger panels, that is where the resolution was really needed. You know, there was all kinds of distance charts, if you remember, years ago, where from a certain distance, 1080p looked like 720p and so on and so forth. If you were too far away, it didn't matter. Now, that is true. 4K allowed us to be closer than ever. I have videos on this subject where I'm able to be 5 or 6 feet away from a 75-inch 900E, which was 4K, playing native 4K content, and could get my face right up against the screen. Now, I don't know if I need more than that, is what I'm saying. So when 8K was announced, right, we're talking about 2018, 2019, the Q900R, the Z9G, the Z9. They were very unobtainable displays. The Q900R was the one that was affordable to a degree. I have the 55-inch here from Value Electronics. I've been using it for the last few months. I've done 8K content. I've watched a ton of 8K content. Though it's only 55 inches, I've watched it from about 2 or 3 feet away, and I have a good grasp of what it can provide. And that's something we're going to talk about. But what I'm trying to say is, flipping back around, though, just lost my train of thought for 1 second. I apologize. It's late. I won't edit that out or anything. But the need for it, the need for that resolution. We were told, and switching gears quickly to marketing, very important, the marketing, 4 times the resolution. Do you remember 1080i, 720p, standard definition, DVD, VHS? Everything was 4 times, 8 times the clarity, HDR, high dynamic range. A lot of the marketing behind that promised what wasn't really, it didn't necessarily yield cleaner results. So when 4K first kind of came out, there was a great article called Going Against the Grain. And it talked about how grain structure in Blu-rays, because there wasn't 4K Blu-rays at the time, or no, there was. It was Ghostbusters and a couple others. They did a side-by-side for some casual viewers, and they found that people preferred the 1080p version, as the grain structure on the other 4K Blu-rays was heavier and the image was noisier. Most likely because they weren't native 4K. They were up conversions, which is very important to what we're talking about here, is content being native. When I was talking about the larger 900E being very close to it, that was playing, native 4K content on a PC. And I really didn't feel there was an issue with the image being too soft or not sharp enough. Now, interestingly enough, this, not fear-mongering, but this insecurity and kind of jealousy, I've been part of it. I had a 1080i TV, a projection LCD from Sony, DLP, and then had 1080p come out literally like 3 or 4 months later. And when 4K was coming out, I had my first 4K panel, Samsung JS, in 2015. So 2015, for those of you that think that 4K just came out a few years ago. Now, you might not remember that, but my first major 4K display was in 2016. It was a Vizio P-Series. At 75 inches, at $4,000, that panel was affordable. It actually was highly recommended because it was only $4,000. That 8K Z8H at 75 inches is $4,500. I don't think that's a bargain. But I'm telling you that part of the comments were, well, hey, do you think a $500 price drop is a lot? No, I don't think it's a huge drop. But the video was simply reporting on the fact that it dropped at all from where it's been for the last number of months. So I know I'm all over the map. So 8K. I personally, this is where we're having confusion. I personally don't have any need for it. Where I am in this room of mine, this small media room, I had a 77-inch LG CX, which is coming back to me. It's being calibrated right now. I felt that that was probably the limit of where I could go resolution due to how close I am. Gaming 4 to 5 feet from, not that far from a 77-inch panel, and then probably 8 to 9 feet. I felt that the CX at 77 was slightly soft. Now, it could be because I was testing 49-inch panels that had the pixel density was very, it was just very sharp. I think I struggled there. But I felt that probably 85 inches would be the limit for 4K, but it might be too much for me in this room. So I wouldn't go larger than 85 at 4K, but I do feel like the need for 8K would be 85 and up. So why I think it's not necessary. A lot of people will say, well, there's no 8K content. There isn't. Now, I was able to game 8K using a DisplayPort adapter, using my PC through HDMI 2.1, and was able to game 8K. It is super, super clean, like razor clean. However, at 30 FPS, I find that unplayable now. We've been spoiled with 4K 60 and 4K 120 lately. So I feel like 4K 60 is the sweet spot. Meaning if you have a 4K panel right now that doesn't have HDMI 2.1, you still have the best of the resolution and the frame rate. So yes, I love HDMI 2.1. I enjoy 4K 120. But if I had to be stuck at 4K 60, I'd be fine. I don't really ever look at, especially gaming, especially native 4K, and say, I wish that was cleaner. I have found that in the last number of years, it's not really the resolution, it's the content. It's the content. If you're watching Avatar in 1080p and you push people out of the room and then bring them back in and tell them it's 8K, most of them are going to think it's 8K. Native 8K content, a lot of the demos that we see, the demos that my friend Jennifer makes that are actually in that native resolution, yes, it's clearly better. Gaming at native 8K, keeping it up still, it was clearly cleaner. I didn't know if it was necessary. Not necessary right now, which is why technology is so important. We're talking about it right this minute. Like many of you, I was not thrilled to hear that not only 4K was coming, but then it was 4K HDR. Atmos 5.1, Pro Logic 7.1. All these little jumps, not little jumps, some are large jumps that make you need entirely new equipment. Now we've gotten to a spot where there's HDMI 2.1. We have the new consoles, which we're going to touch on really quick. I have both the PS5 and the Series X. Before those consoles even came out, I had noted that they wouldn't really be able to do 4K 60. Now, many people will say, well, they do 4K 60. Well, go over to Digital Foundry, which great channel, by the way, and watch. Yes, they're doing 4K, low settings, medium settings, dynamic resolution. So yes, it is gorgeous, and it is miles better than what you saw on the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X in some instances. But they're nowhere near able to do anything 8K. They're not. Now, you could get a really old game like Half-Life or Doom 3 8K at 30 FPS. But then you can say goodbye to ray tracing, if you're familiar with PC. So yes, you can play 8K 30 on a RTX 3090, probably at 30 FPS on low settings. And what's funny is, yes, at 8K, anti-aliasing isn't quite necessary. However, if you are playing at 80-something inches, just like 4K, anti-aliasing wasn't needed on small monitors. It is needed on TVs. You can see the noise in the image. You can see the jaggies and the shimmering. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it necessary right now? No. The point I'm trying to make is it's not up to you. It's not up to me. Now, yes, we are the consumer. And much like you're seeing in films today of movies that we don't love, movies that are pushing certain things to us that we're choosing not to go see. Yes, 2 and 3 years later, you're just starting to see a change. So if we do that here with TVs, yes, in 2 or 3 years, you'll see a change. However, that's not going to be 8K. 8K is going to be fully in. Why is 8K here? Very simple. 8 versus 4. Consumers want to see, which one do I get? I hear this when I'm in Best Buy. You'll have an older couple go up to a salesman and say, which one should I get? Well, honey, 4K or 8K? Huh, 8K. Simple math. Identifying marketing. Triple, extreme processor, cognitive processor, whatever. None of that means anything to the average person that's just out there looking. 8 is more than 4. Or there would have been 6K. Many of us in gaming wanted a 1440p display. Now, I'll illustrate it this way. The jump from 1080p to 4K. Consoles nearly completely missed out on 1080p. The 360 couldn't do 1080p. The PS3 had 1 or 2 games that could touch 1080p. Both new consoles were doing 900p. That was the Xbox One. The PS4 had a softer 1080p. I had them, still have them. By the time they were able to actually take advantage of 1080p, we were into 4K, right? So then when I had a 4K TV, going back to 2016, 2017, I was playing an Xbox One S, which was still 900p, but had HDR. And what was that? It was a noisy mess because it was just upscaling the image. Upscaling, regardless of what the marketing tells you, isn't making the image really 8K. It's not really smoothing anything out. Downsampling does that. Upscaling is really just adding false pixels to an image to make it fit the screen. And sometimes it does look nice. But a lot of times, as I illustrated on some of my 8K videos of gaming, I had the CX showing Days Gone from PS5, and then on the Q900R, the same image, you could see where it cleaned up the armor a little bit, but in the trees and in the grass, the image on the CX was soft but more realistic, and the 8K image was noisy and staticky. Now, that's not cleaner. That's not 4 times the resolution. So while we're having this conversation, I'm with you. And a lot of media is with you as far as us YouTubers. A lot of us that are in this, I'm one of the smallest in my space. And a lot of us are like, yeah, I mean, it's exciting to a degree. But when you get into the larger channels that do, whether they're sponsored or they sell that equipment, yes, they're excited about 8K. It's a company selling that to them. I'm not accusing anybody of being sponsored. Those that are actually sponsored, of course, they're going to tell you, yeah, it's striking, it's beautiful. And it is beautiful. But I would challenge you to take 4K panels next to 8K panels and switch them around and put the same content and see what you think. Now, the retort to that is native 8K content, you will see a difference. And the retort to that is there isn't any. There's not the bandwidth to really give that to you. Our cable boxes are 1080i. Our game systems, as I illustrated to you with the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, they completely missed 1080p. They went right after 4K. Neither one of them could really do native, clean 4K on a lot of titles. And now we're going to jump to 8K. The TV manufacturers know this. But if you have a decent 4K display, there isn't much reason to upgrade other than size. All right, so if you went and bought a 4K TV when 4K first came out, the big marketing difference was HDR. So I remember in Samsung's One Connect box could be updated to HDR. And HDR came out, and very little was in HDR. Just like very little was in 4K. And a lot of times the 4K content was upscaled 720p or 1080p, and at times looked worse. HDR began to trickle out. Then we had fake HDR, real HDR wasn't bright enough to take advantage of HDR, all that mess. That's where we are right now with 8K. 8K really doesn't say in its marketing the largest screen imaginable. It doesn't say have the biggest screen there is. 8K is basically promising clean, crisp, vibrant, amazing, all these things. And I don't think it's not that. But the difference between 8K and 4K is 4K, there was discs coming. There are no 8K discs from what I understand in the pipeline. These consoles are brand new. Now, will they have Xbox Series X Pro? Yes, of course there will be one. Will they be able to afford to make them do 8K? I don't think so. At least not for a few years. And we're talking again, in terms of all of us, in years. Now, what I meant about being insecure or jealous, if you have a 8K display, don't get upset. I'm not putting them down. Be proud of the panel that you bought. The Z9G, the Z8H, the Q900R, the Q900TS, the Q800T, they're all awesome. But you're buying those panels based on what they can do with 4K. You're buying those panels because they were great panels. You weren't buying them because they do 8K. Sony couldn't even do 8K with YouTube. So if you had a Z9G, what you were buying was an amazing LED with backlight master drive. Same as if you were buying the Z8H. Doesn't mean that you fell for it. I mean, you want the cutting edge, you have it. But sometimes with the cutting edge, you have your first, and then obviously things get cheaper as we go. Now we're talking about the A90J. We're talking about these beautiful 4K panels coming out. The reason I bought the CX was, for me, 4K was at its peak. It was at as good as it was going to get. And I would say that my next panel would probably be 8K. Not because I want it, but because I'm going to have to get that panel. It's going to be inadvertent. I'm not going to have a choice. When 1080p was being phased out, I'll never forget I was watching Cedric on ratings.com. Love them, by the way. And Cedric was on camera at that time. And he was reviewing the Sony curved 1080p TV. And I remember he was even saying in that video, this might be the last 1080p display that has high-end specs. Meaning you're going to start seeing things that are only on 8K panels. You're going to start seeing, they're talking about the C class, the C1, and those being not exactly the highest end. They were never the high end of LG, but the only differences were really the body of the display. Now you're seeing, what's the C is going to be this level and that level. They're going to start pushing it. And yes, the Z9 and the ZX are still extremely expensive. That's how 4K was. That's how 1080p was. But we couldn't put the brakes on it. Now, where this is in your control is that if you just bought a 4K panel, it will last you as long as you want it to. Meaning 4K Blu-rays are there. They're not really going to be any more Blu-rays. Your Netflix, all of your streaming services are all going to be 4K. They're not going to be in 8K. And if they are, so what? 4K looks incredible. And why a lot of us were a little upset with 8K coming out was we didn't see any more improvements to 4K. Many of us were in love with the Z9D from Sony. We were in love with, at least my favorite TVs at the time were the Z9D and the Q9FN from Samsung. And what we wanted was high contrast ratio. This is the LEDs. Deep blacks, extreme peak brightness. 4,000 nits is what we always heard that we needed. And then we started to back away from that, where even some of these TVs could do a couple thousand nits in really small windows. Quantum XP series hit 3, Z9G hit 4, but then if you look at the other brighter Samsungs, they didn't really come close to that again. And the contrast ratio went the other way because we want an X-wide viewing and solve 4K. is what I said in that 8K video. Solve 4K. Eliminate blooming. Make the picture more vibrant. Instead, the picture became more faded to let me see from the sides. But they, instead of fixing blooming or fixing black crush, we're just going to jump up because nobody is going to buy the next LG without black crush. There's no marketing for that. We all want 12-bit. It's what we've all asked for. 12-bit is not a marketing thing. The average person, the average consumer is going to walk in. They're going to say, that's a new 12-bit display. They're going to go, what? What? 8K. Oh, that sounds better than 4K. It's that basic. Now, as I mentioned before, also, I know I'm all over the map because you don't see me reading off anything or script or anything. That 4K analogy going against the grain, that article that I told you about, as I'm watching more and more 4K Blu-rays come out, they're trickling out. And even the John Carpenter series was kind of thrown together. Even the Lord of the Rings didn't come out individually at first. It kind of came out together. And I love some of those movies, but you're seeing that they're just kind of throwing them out there. I think they know that the improvement, to me, 1080p was almost the wall. I would have liked to see 1080p HDR, 1440p. I think they know that clarity in film is always going to be the content creator. And making movies as clean as absolutely possible. Everything is a 2K upscale. It's been that way forever. When they did like Gemini Man, it takes away from the performance. So if you saw The Hobbit at 60 FPS in the theater, or was it 120 FPS in the theater? I can't remember, but it just didn't look real. Or I shouldn't say, it looked more like it had soap opera effect. So if I'm directing that film, if you look at Zack Snyder's movies, there's this like 300, they have all these like filters. That doesn't benefit 4K. It's not grain hate. It's to the point where they're starting to add fake grain. So my point being, resolution isn't helping you. I didn't see any of the movies on the Q900R look better than the CX because of resolution. It might have looked brighter. Specular highlights popped more because it's twice as bright. I never said to myself, even right up to the screen, there's the resolution. Now in gaming, I did, but performance-wise, that's far away. And especially since these 8K panels were so expensive. But if you have one of those, you're good. Hold on to it. But if you just bought a A8H or a TCL or a Hisense or any of that, 4K is not being phased out by you. You still have all the time in the world with it. I'd be happy with 4K. I mean, the reason I'm getting my CX back and not getting something next year is there's really nothing else I want to spend more money on, especially 8K. There's no benefit to 8K. Now, if you bought, as I mentioned before, a Z9G, a 900 TS, a 950 TS, don't be insecure. You bought the best panel. You bought the flagship, but you didn't buy it because of 8K content. You bought it because it was a nice LED or a nice OLED, right? So now that we're back to my comments, or the comments I was addressing, it is being phased out. Samsung has already moved on. They will begin to cripple their own lineup in a way of where the highest specs will be with their top of the line. I was happy to know the A90J was still going to be 4K. You know, they have the Z9J coming out. You know, you're going to start seeing that happen with them. Maybe not this year. But guys, keep in mind, we are in this year. I know it doesn't feel that way. 2021 is a wrap. Those TVs are built. Now they're moving on to the next year. So phasing out, by the way, as I mentioned, what I mean phase is phase, not decapitate or cut. It's going to take a little while to phase out. But it doesn't mean that you should buy 8K. It doesn't mean that you should look at your display any different. Like, it is so much like a relationship. She just doesn't look the same to me. It's not that way. I am completely happy with 4K. Now, if I wanted to put a 90-inch TV in here, I think I would have to, at that point, need 8K. But at that point, the resolution is just because I'm up close. But upscaled 4K at 90 inches is still going to look better on a 4K display at a regular size. But my point is, you're not going to be looking at 8K content. Not from Netflix, not from Amazon Prime, not from any of them, due to bandwidth. And these movies that we all love, I keep pointing over here like you can see it, like 1,000 Blu-rays. They looked better on a 1080p plasma than they do upscaled on a 4K TV. Just my opinion. Native will always look better than upscaled. Again, my opinion. From what I've seen, things on my 1080p plasma that were 1080p, whether it's cable, football, looked better. Not because it was sharper, because it was native. It wasn't smooth, or it was smooth. Didn't have like that static to it. So, gaming, the resolution and the frame rate combined is amazing. I used to fight with PC people all the time before I had a PC. They were gaming on monitors years ago. I was gaming on consoles. And they're like, dude, I've been playing 1080p forever. Or even 720p, but they're playing at a 60 FPS. And I was like, well, yeah, I'm on a TV playing. The TV's big. They're like, dude, once you feel 60, you're never going back. Then I had a PC. I had 1080p 60. Which, bringing this full circle, 1080p 60 wasn't good enough for a 65-inch plasma. So I had another graphics card to run DSR, which was downsampling from NVIDIA. That looked clean. Not because the resolution wasn't any good, the panel was too large and I was too close. Now that I've had 60, and many of us in consoles are just experiencing 60 for the first time, you want to jump to 8K and think it's going to be there? You can jump to 8K. TCL is not going to give you a choice. Their flagships are going to be 8K. But you have to accept the fact that they're going in that direction. Maybe not all the way, but it is coming. My whole thing in 31 minutes is I don't want it. All I'm simply telling you is that it's been here. It's coming. 2 years ago, I did the video on why 8K wasn't necessary. It was 2 years ago. It's going to be necessary because they're going to give it to you. And they're going to take their engineering teams, that's their B team, is staying there, and their A team is already working on the 8K stuff. Simply because people are going to buy it. That simple. And for gaming, 8K is cool. Don't get me wrong. If you guys have Will of the Wisps on Xbox Series X, there is like an 8K, 6K part of that game, which looks much cleaner than the 4K 120. Play that for a few minutes. I'm like, wow, that looks really cool. And then went right back to the 4K 120 because the resolution and the motion was amazing. And I'm not saying that you'll find that better, but give it a shot if you have that game. But yes, 8K to me is still silly. It's not necessary. I don't want it personally. And to me, honestly, this little tiny TV, larger than the 77-inch, larger than 85 or the 83-inch, what we're looking at for the new Sonys, I'm looking at a projector at that size. I don't think I'm going to want a 100-inch TV. I would look at a laser projector, a short throw, regular throw, but a 4K projector at that point. So, is 8K necessary? No. Is 8K phasing out 4K? Yes. Is 8K here? Yes. It's just the way it is. And I'm going to tell you when the price drops for them. But don't get upset. It's not saying your TV's not any good. A lot of you are still rocking 1080p TVs and you're very happy. And actually, until recently, when I had people with 1080p say to me, dude, should I upgrade? Up until probably a year ago, I was like, if you're not gaming, keep it. Enjoy your ZT60, your VT60, your Panasonic Hero Elite. Enjoy those. Because gaming was the only place where 4K was native. The majority of the 4K Blu-rays I have are upscales. And upscaling can be ugly. I watched 300 on both the CX and the Q900R. It was already a noisy image. The upscaling made it so noisy it was unwatchable. Now, I had to tune the Samsung down a lot to get it. I'm not taking anything away from the Samsung, but I'm saying that with a movie that noisy, the resolution didn't help it. And many of you were seeing that when you first got 4K and you watched cable for the first time. Remember that. You're like, damn, that doesn't look very good. That looked much better on what I had before. Panels were brighter, but you were really seeing an upscale instead of a native image. And CRTs look better. And it's always how it's going to be. But regardless of whether we want it or not, they're going to give it to us, because once you have a nice 4K display, like I mentioned, or anything you have, the only reason to go up is there's no other choice. So for you guys, if you're going to upgrade and you have to inadvertently go 8K, go 8K. But don't go 8K because there's going to be 8K content, because there isn't any. But it is here, and we don't have any choice. All right, guys, that is a long 35-minute 8K video. I just throw these out there. I hope you enjoyed it. It's really there to build a discussion with you guys. I will see you in the comments. Let me know what you think. Do you have 8K? Do you want 8K? What are your thoughts on what I said in regards to gaming and movies? Those are just my thoughts. I'll see you in the comments. Thank you so very much. Take care.